The moment Claire stepped into the Manhattan boardroom for the $10 billion deal signing, the laughter started. The executives who'd flown in from 3 continents to finalize the acquisition of Morrison Industries couldn't believe this woman in her modest dress was the mysterious heir they'd been negotiating with for months. Marcus, her husband of 7 years, sat at the conference table beside his mistress Vanessa, both wearing matching Cartier watches Claire had never seen before, and they were laughing the loudest. "This is the person who thinks she owns Morrison Industries?" Vanessa's voice dripped with contempt as she lifted her wine glass, a $3,000 Chateau Margaux the company had provided for the celebration. "Let me help you understand your place," she said, and before anyone could react, she poured the entire glass down the front of Claire's dress, the deep red liquid staining the cream fabric like blood. The room went silent. Marcus smirked, waiting for his wife to crumble the way she always did, to apologize and disappear. But Claire didn't move. She didn't wipe the wine from her skin. Instead, she pulled a single document from her leather portfolio and placed it on the polished mahogany table. And what happened in the next 60 seconds would strip Marcus and Vanessa of everything they'd schemed to steal. But who was Claire really? What did that document contain? And how had a woman they'd mocked and dismissed for years secretly inherited an empire worth $10 billion without anyone knowing? Not even the man who'd shared her bed while plotting her destruction? Claire Morrison had learned to make herself invisible long before she understood why. Growing up in the sprawling Morrison estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut, she'd been the quiet daughter of Richard Morrison, a man whose name appeared on Fortune 500 lists and whose handshake could move markets. Her mother had died when Claire was 6, a riding accident that left her father emotionally sealed, and Claire had spent her childhood wandering marble hallways that echoed with emptiness. The staff knew her better than Richard did. By the time she was 12, she could recite the Morrison Industries quarterly reports better than she could remember the sound of her mother's voice. Richard Morrison had built his empire from nothing, transforming a small manufacturing company into a global conglomerate spanning technology, real estate, and energy. But he'd never wanted his daughter involved in the business. "You're too soft for this world, Claire," he'd told her once, his voice not unkind but final. "You feel too much. This business will eat people like you alive." So Claire had studied literature at Columbia instead of business at Wharton. She'd volunteered at community centers in Queens instead of interning at Morrison Industries headquarters. And when she'd met Marcus Chen at a charity gala 7 years ago, she'd introduced herself as simply Claire, a woman who loved books and worked part-time at a nonprofit. She'd never mentioned the Morrison name, never mentioned the trust funds or the inheritance waiting in some distant future. Marcus had seemed perfect then, charming, ambitious, working his way up at a mid-tier investment firm. He'd told her he loved how real she was, how different from the shallow women who measured everything in dollar signs. They'd married within a year, a small ceremony that Richard had attended but not celebrated. Her father had died 18 months later, a massive stroke in his office at Morrison Industries. He was 63. The funeral had been enormous, a procession of corporate titans and politicians. But Claire had stood alone at the graveside, Marcus beside her, but somehow absent even then. What no one knew, not Marcus, not the board of directors, not even the executives who ran Morrison Industries, was what Richard Morrison had actually left behind. His will had been sealed, handled by a single attorney named Bernard Hastings, who'd been Richard's confidant for 40 years. The public documents showed the expected charitable foundations, endowments, stock distributions to key executives. But there was a second document, one that only Bernard and Claire knew existed. In the final year of his life, Richard had watched his daughter more carefully than she'd realized. He'd seen how Marcus had started coming home late, how he'd become secretive with his phone, how his eyes had changed when he looked at Claire. Richard Morrison hadn't built an empire by being a fool. The sealed provision in Richard's will was elegantly simple and absolutely devastating. Claire Morrison would inherit 100% ownership of Morrison Industries, all assets, all subsidiaries, all international holdings, but not immediately. She would receive it exactly 7 years after Richard's death, on her 33rd birthday. Until then, the company would be managed by the existing board, with Clare listed only as a minor beneficiary of a family trust. The reasoning, Bernard had explained to Clare after the funeral, was protection. "Your father knew someone might come after you for the inheritance," Bernard had said, his 70-year-old eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "This way, you'd see who people really were before you had the power to destroy them." Clare had spent those 7 years watching. Marcus had revealed himself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. The late nights had become overnights. The mysterious expenses on credit cards had multiplied. And then 2 years ago, Vanessa had appeared, a junior executive at Marcus's firm who laughed too loud and touched him too familiarly at company parties. Clare had said nothing. She'd played the role of the oblivious wife because something her father once said had lodged in her memory. The most powerful position is the one your enemies don't know you hold. 6 months ago, Clare had started receiving concerning calls from Bernard Hastings. Marcus had been asking questions about Morrison Industries through back channels. He'd been researching corporate acquisition laws, and he'd been meeting with private equity firms, discussing something he called the Morrison opportunity. It had taken Bernard's investigators only 3 weeks to uncover the full scope of the betrayal. Marcus and Vanessa had been planning to divorce Clare immediately after her 33rd birthday. They discovered, through Marcus's obsessive digging, that Clare was due to inherit something from Morrison Industries. They just didn't know what. They'd assumed it was a trust fund, maybe $20 or $30 million. Their plan was to take half in the divorce, then use Vanessa's connections to acquire Morrison Industries in a leveraged buyout, using Clare's settlement money as their entry point. The night before the deal signing, Clare had sat in the apartment she'd shared with Marcus for 7 years. He was out, presumably with Vanessa, celebrating what they believed was their coming victory. Clare had looked at the wedding photos still hanging on the walls, images of a woman who'd believed in love and a man who'd seen only opportunity. She'd felt something harden inside her chest, something that might have been her father's legacy finally taking root. The next morning, she'd put on the modest cream dress Marcus always criticized, the one he said made her look poor and plain. She'd chosen it deliberately. The boardroom of Morrison Industries occupied the entire 53rd floor of the tower Richard Morrison had built in Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, and the morning light turned the city into something that looked almost beautiful. The executives from Tokyo, London, Frankfurt, and Dubai had already assembled, 16 men and women who collectively controlled companies worth hundreds of billions. They were here to finalize the acquisition of Morrison Industries by a consortium Marcus and Vanessa had secretly organized, a deal that would net them nearly $500 million in finder's fees in equity stakes. Clare had watched them file in, had seen how Marcus's hand rested on Vanessa's lower back, proprietary and proud. She'd seen how Vanessa's Hermes bag cost more than Clare's monthly nonprofit salary, how her engagement ring, Marcus had proposed last month apparently, caught the light like a declaration of war. Bernard Hastings had tried to prepare her. They'll be cruel, he'd warned. They think they've won, and people are always cruelest when they think they're untouchable. But Clare had underestimated the depth of their contempt. The laughter when she'd entered had been genuine, full-throated mockery. "Is this a joke?" one of the Dubai executives had asked. "Did someone hire entertainment?" Marcus had actually smiled at her, the kind of smile you give a stranger you're about to humiliate. "Clare, what are you doing here?" "This is a business meeting." Vanessa had been the one to stand, wine glass in hand, and Clare had seen in that moment exactly what her father had tried to protect her from 7 years ago. The wine had been cold against her skin, the alcohol smell overwhelming. The boardroom had gone silent except for the sound of liquid dripping onto the marble floor. Clare had felt every eye on her, had felt the weight of their judgment and amusement. Marcus had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for her to leave. Vanessa had set down the empty wine glass with a delicate clink. "Someone should call security," she'd said. "This woman is clearly disturbed." That was when Clare had reached into her portfolio and pulled out the document Bernard had prepared, the inheritance papers signed by Richard Morrison 7 years and 1 day ago. The certification from Morrison Industries Board of Directors, executed this morning at 9 a.m. sharp, and the transfer documents showing that as of her 33rd birthday, which had been yesterday, Clare Morrison owned 100% of Morrison Industries and all its assets. She'd placed the papers in front of Marcus first, watched his face as he read the first page, then the second, then flipped through the rest with increasing speed, his skin going from tan to ashen. "This can't be real," he'd whispered. Vanessa had grabbed the papers from him, her perfectly manicured nails scrabbling at the pages. The executives around the table had begun to shift, confusion replacing their earlier amusement. The lead attorney for the consortium, a woman from Frankfurt named Elise Schmidt, had stood and walked around the table. She'd read the documents over Vanessa's shoulder, and Clare had watched her professional mask slip. "Mein Gott," Elise had breathed. She'd looked at Clare with new eyes. "You're the Morrison heir. You're the owner?" Clare had finally allowed herself to smile. The sole owner, actually, as of yesterday. The next 15 minutes had been chaos. Marcus had tried to argue, had claimed fraud, had actually shouted that Clare was too stupid to own anything. Vanessa had started crying, mascara running down her cheeks, her earlier cruelty transforming into desperate pleading. But the executives had understood immediately. They'd flown across the world to finalize an acquisition with what they'd believed were legitimate representatives of Morrison Industries. Instead, they'd been negotiating with two people who had zero authority and had attempted to sell a company they didn't own. The legal implications were staggering. Bernard Hastings had entered then, right on cue, accompanied by Morrison Industries' actual board of directors. The legitimate one that had been managing the company under Richard's instructions. They'd filed into the room like a tribunal, and the consortium executives had begun gathering their materials, their faces careful blanks. This meeting was over. Clare had turned to Marcus then, the man she'd loved once, the man she'd built a life with. "I'm filing for divorce today," she'd told him quietly. "You'll get nothing. The prenuptial agreement you insisted on ironically works in my favor now. You get only what you brought to the marriage, which was about $15,000 in student loans and a used Honda Accord." Marcus's face had twisted with rage and disbelief. "You can't do this. I'm your husband. I have rights." Clare had felt something like pity, but it was distant, abstract. "You had a wife," she'd corrected. "What you actually wanted was an opportunity." She'd turned to Vanessa next, the woman whose wine still stained her dress. "You'll be hearing from Morrison Industries' legal team regarding the fraud you attempted to perpetrate. I believe corporate fraud at this level carries a potential sentence of 10 to 15 years. Vanessa had grabbed Clare's arm then, her grip desperate. "Please, you don't understand. Marcus told me you were just some trust fund nobody. He said this was legitimate. I didn't know." Clare had looked down at the hand on her arm. At the engagement ring Marcus had probably bought with money he'd been embezzling. That would be another investigation Bernard had promised to conduct. "The wine," Clare had said softly. "Was that legitimate? Did Marcus tell you to humiliate me, or did you think of that yourself?" Vanessa had released her arm, and Clare had stepped back. "I hope it was worth it," she'd said. "That bottle cost $3,000. It's going to be the most expensive mistake of your life." The meeting had dissolved after that. The consortium executives had filed out, already on phones with their own legal teams. Bernard had approached with a warm smile, the first genuine kindness Clare had experienced all morning. "Your father would be proud," he'd said. Clare had nodded, but she wasn't sure that was true. Richard Morrison had been a hard man who'd built an empire through ruthlessness. What Clare had just done was survive, which was different. She left the boardroom with Bernard, leaving Marcus and Vanessa sitting in the ruins of their scheme. She'd heard Marcus call her name once, desperate, but she hadn't turned around. Some doors once closed should stay that way. 3 weeks later, Clare sat in what used to be her father's office on the 62nd floor of Morrison Tower. The desk was mahogany, the chair leather, and the view stretched all the way to the Atlantic on clear days. Bernard had arranged a transition team, executives who'd worked with Richard and understood the business. They'd been respectful but skeptical, understandably so, given that Clare's business experience consisted of managing a nonprofit's annual budget of $80,000, but she'd surprised them. All those years of reading her father's quarterly reports, all those childhood hours spent absorbing the language of industry and acquisition had given her a foundation. More importantly, she'd spent 7 years learning to see what people hid, to recognize deception and ambition. Those were skills that translated. The divorce papers had been filed the same day as the boardroom confrontation. Marcus had tried to fight, had hired an aggressive attorney who'd attempted to argue that Claire's inheritance was marital property. The argument had lasted exactly 1 hearing. The prenuptial agreement Marcus had insisted on, just to protect us both, he'd said 7 years ago, specified that inheritance from parents remained separate property. His own words had become his prison. He'd walked away with nothing except the used Honda Accord, though even that had been repossessed due to unpaid loans. The last Claire had heard, he'd moved back to Oregon to live with his parents. Vanessa's situation was worse. The attempted fraud had resulted in criminal charges, and her legal career was effectively over. Morrison Industries had pursued the case vigorously, partially for the principal and partially, Claire suspected, because Bernard wanted to send a message about what happened to people who targeted his friend's daughter. But sitting in her father's chair, looking out over the city he'd conquered, Claire felt less triumph than a strange, hollow uncertainty. The company was worth $10 billion. It employed 37,000 people across 6 continents, and she'd never wanted any of it. Second thoughts? Bernard stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He'd been stopping by every afternoon, a ritual that felt both comforting and like surveillance. Claire accepted the coffee and gestured for him to sit. "I keep thinking about what my father said," she admitted, "that I was too soft for this world." Bernard settled into the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. "Richard said a lot of things. Not all of them were right. He built all of this." Claire's gesture encompassed the office, the building, the empire. "I just inherited it. What if I destroy it?" Bernard sipped his coffee, took his time answering. "Your father built Morrison Industries by being harder than everyone else. He won by being willing to sacrifice more, to push further, to care less about the casualties. It made him successful. It also made him very, very alone." He leaned forward. "You have a different gift, Claire. You see people. Really see them. Marcus and Vanessa made the mistake of thinking that made you weak, but the ability to understand what people need, what drives them, what they fear, that's not weakness. That's the most valuable intelligence there is." Claire thought about the executives she'd been meeting with over the past 3 weeks. She'd noticed things. How the CFO was exhausted because his daughter was struggling with addiction. How the head of European operations lit up when discussing renewable energy, but went flat when talking about the company's fossil fuel investments. How the youngest VP had ideas she was too intimidated to share. These were the kinds of details her father would have dismissed as irrelevant. But Claire had started having one-on-one lunches, asking questions, actually listening. The company hadn't transformed overnight, but something was shifting. People worked differently when they felt seen. "The Dubai consortium reached out yesterday," Claire said, changing the subject. "They want to revisit the acquisition conversation. Legitimate this time." Bernard raised an eyebrow. "What did you tell them?" Claire smiled, an expression that would have shocked Marcus and Vanessa with its edge. "I told them Morrison Industries isn't for sale, but I'd be interested in discussing how we might acquire some of their holdings in sustainable technology." Bernard laughed, the sound genuine and surprised. "Richard always said you were more dangerous than you looked." I'm beginning to think he was right. The nonprofit Claire had worked at, a literacy program for immigrant families in Queens, had assumed she'd quit after inheriting. Instead, she'd endowed it with $5 million and still volunteered there every Saturday. The director, a woman named Maria, who'd become a friend over the years, had been overwhelmed. "Claire, you don't have to do this anymore," she'd said, tears in her eyes over the endowment check. "You're a billionaire now. You have companies to run." But Claire had shaken her head. "This place kept me human when I was married to Marcus. When everything in my life felt like a performance. I'm not giving that up." She'd meant it. The company needed her attention, yes, but the children struggling to read English needed her too. and they'd never known her as anyone other than Miss Clare who brought books and enthusiasm. That version of herself felt more real than the woman in the boardroom who destroyed her husband's scheme. Marcus had tried to contact her once since the divorce. An email sent at 3 a.m, rambling and bitter. He'd called her vindictive, cruel, a liar who'd manipulated him. He'd claimed he'd loved her once, before she'd revealed herself to be as cold as her father. Clare had read it twice, looking for any hint of the man she'd married, any acknowledgement of the betrayal he'd committed. There was none. Only wounded pride and the rage of someone who'd believed themselves entitled to something that was never theirs. She deleted the email without responding. Some conversations had no productive endpoint. Vanessa had taken a plea deal to avoid trial, 3 years of probation, community service, and a permanent mark on her record that would follow her forever. She'd sent Clare a letter, handwritten, attempting apology. "I know what I did was wrong," it read. "Marcus told me you didn't care about him anymore, that you'd be happy to be free. I believed him because I wanted to. I'm sorry." Clare had kept that letter. Not for forgiveness. Forgiveness felt too distant, too generous. But as a reminder, Vanessa had been cruel because Marcus had taught her Clare was someone who could be treated with cruelty. That was its own lesson about complicity. Bernard had asked Clare what she wanted to do with Morrison Industries long term. "Your father's model was growth at any cost, bigger markets, higher profits, constant expansion. You could continue that. The board would support it. It's what they know." But Clare had been reading the company's environmental impact reports, the labor practice audits, the community complaints from towns where Morrison plants operated. Her father had built an empire, but he'd left damage in his wake. "I want to rebuild differently," she'd told Bernard. "Same company, different values. What if we prioritize sustainability over expansion? What if we invested in our workers instead of extracting maximum profit?" Bernard had smiled. "Your father would think that's naive." Clare had smiled back. "Good. Maybe being different from him is the point." The apartment she'd shared with Marcus had been packed up and cleared within a week. Clare had moved into a smaller place in Brooklyn, a brownstone with a garden she planned to learn to tend. The marble mansion of her childhood remained empty except for staff, too large and too full of her father's ghost. She'd thought about selling it, but something stopped her. Maybe one day she'd have a family, children who'd run through those halls with more joy than she'd known. Or maybe she'd convert it into something useful, a school, a center for the arts. The possibilities felt open in a way they hadn't before. On Clare's 34th birthday, exactly 1 year and 1 day after inheriting Morrison Industries, she stood in the same boardroom where Vanessa had poured wine on her. The company had just announced a major initiative redirecting $2 billion in capital toward renewable energy and sustainable manufacturing. The stock price had initially dipped. Investors were skeptical, but had rebounded strong when the orders started coming in. Corporations wanted to partner with a Morrison Industries that stood for something beyond profit. Bernard was there, along with the full board, and they'd surprised her with a cake in genuine warmth. "To Clare Morrison," the CFO said, raising a glass of sparkling water, "who's proving that different leadership doesn't mean weaker leadership?" Clare cut the cake, shared it with the executives who'd once doubted her, and looked out over the city that now felt less like her father's territory and more like shared ground. She thought about Marcus sometimes, wondered if he'd learned anything from his fall. She thought about Vanessa occasionally, hoped the woman found some path toward redemption. But mostly Clare thought about the 37,000 people who depended on Morrison Industries for their livelihoods, about the communities affected by the company's choices, about the kind of legacy she wanted to build that would be entirely her own. Her father had given her an empire, but what she did with it, how she transformed it from an instrument of pure accumulation into something that actually contributed to the world, that would be her story. That night, Clare returned to her Brooklyn brownstone and sat in the garden she'd been learning to tend. The roses were blooming despite her amateur efforts, and the evening air carried the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's yard. She pulled out her phone and looked at her contacts. There was a number she'd saved but never called. Her college roommate, someone she'd lost touch with during the Marcus years. Clare pressed dial, heard the ringing, felt nervous in a way that board meetings never made her feel. "Claire?" The voice was surprised, warm. "Oh my God, is it really you?" They talked for 2 hours, catching up, laughing, planning to meet for lunch. When Claire finally hung up, she realized she was smiling. Not the calculated smile she'd worn in the boardroom when destroying Marcus's scheme, but something genuine and surprised. This was what winning actually felt like. Not revenge, not triumph over enemies, but the slow reconstruction of a life that felt worth living. The wine stain was gone, washed out of the dress she'd donated to charity. But the lesson remained. Sometimes the people who mock you are just revealing their own emptiness. And sometimes the greatest power isn't destroying them, it's building something they can't touch.